Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I'm David Blight, the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolition at Yale. And you can see our guest, Erica Armstrong Dunbar. This is a very special event, special privilege for me and for the center. We always invite, at one time or another, our winners of the Frederick Douglass Book Prize to do a talk, an interview, or some sort of event somewhere in the year or so after they win the prize. This is or so, a couple of years now. I want to welcome Erica. She is the author first of the book Never Caught, the Washington's Relentless Pursuit of their runaway slave, Ona Judge. That book won the Douglass Book Prize, I believe, 3 years ago. Shared it with Ty Miles, as I recall. Erica did her BA at Penn and her PhD at Columbia, worked with Eric Foner there. She's a historian of social history, urban history, women's history, African-American history, and the history of Philadelphia, which has been a key part of your work, as I know. I think that's where we first met, when you were at the library company, or maybe before. I don't know. Anyway, she's Charles and Mary Beard Professor of History at Rutgers. For some time, she worked at the Library Company of Philadelphia and ran their African-American history or studies program. And she has now made quite a turn in her writing life, and is also the author of She Came to Slay, which is described as a kind of a primer book for adult readers about Harriet Tubman. And she's now at work on a multi-book project, as I understand it, of books for young readers, which will include first a book called A Spy in Richmond, and there will be others to come. There is also, as I understand it, Erica, a children's version of Never Caught, which is already out. And Erica, among other things, is also one of the leaders of the Association of Black Women's History, which is a relatively new organization, but a growing organization. And I must say, too, involved in film, which I think we will discuss in the course of this conversation, which is what this is going to be. And I think we're going to have some good fun at it. I should say at the outset, we welcome questions. I put them in the Q&A anytime during our discussion, and 45 or 50 minutes into this, we will break and go to questions. But first of all, Erica, welcome. And thanks for taking time to do this. I want to first get you to talk about Never Caught. I mean, it's been such a hit book, an important book, an unusual book. First of all, I mean, it is the story of the Washingtons, George and Martha Washington, and their slave, eventually, as the title indicates, runaway slave named Ona Judge. Now, how did you land on this topic? How did you discover this topic? And then I want to get you talking about how you reconstructed this story.
Yeah, well, first, let me just thank you for the invitation. I'm glad it took us some time, but here we are, and delighted to be in conversation with you. I feel I'm just a really fortunate person. I think, at least in terms of the work that I do, I get to spend my days reading and writing and thinking about Black women, and was never imagined that I could have the kind of career that I do, one that allows me to kind of love every sort of moment of it. I think from the very beginning, from my undergrad days, I sort of gravitated towards history. Maybe that has to do with growing up in Philadelphia, with having kind of all of the sort of markers of the founding of the nation around me.
Mhm.
I was influenced by it. But what became kind of clear to me as I was growing up was that I didn't necessarily see the markers of people who looked like me, who were as involved in the founding of the nation as were those who had marble statues or monuments. And um, at some point, I think it was actually while I was at Penn, and I had the great honor of having an advisor, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, who would leave me to go to Harvard in my senior year, but still took care of me. And you know, she made me believe that I could be a historian, and that I had stories that I wanted to tell, and that I needed to invest and really sort of dedicate my life to it. And so that's what I did. And my first book was about the ways in which Black women found freedom in the North. And that book's called A Fragile Freedom. And in
Right.
many ways, I say that was the kind of, that was the groundwork
Mhm.
that I did in order to be able to write Never Caught. And I was actually finishing up research on the first book when this is what happens to us, David, you know, as historians, we're researching one thing and we go down a rabbit hole. And
So you're working on free Black communities in the North and women's experiences, and you run into Ona Judge?
and I did. I was looking through newspapers as we do, right? Um, Thinking about just kind of wanted to get a feel in everyday life, the end of the 18th century. And I came across a runaway slave advertisement
Mhm.
in the Philadelphia Gazette.
Mhm.
And the first thing that caught me was I read the bottom of the ad, or rather the first part of the ad, which said, absconded from the household of the President of the United States. And that was the moment where I was like, wait, okay. And I kept reading, and there she was. They called her Oni Judge. I call her Ona, which is the name she went by at the end of her life. And but I believe that Oni was a kind of nickname, like a
Yeah.
diminutive. And so I saw this advertisement about a young woman who's described as mulatto and bushy haired and freckled, who had run away from the most important, powerful, one could argue, person at the time. And I was really conflicted at that moment. I was like, well, I want to focus on this, but I had to finish that other book and, you know, get tenure and those things. And I thought, well, maybe I can find a way to weave it into this first book. And then I decided, no, I'm going to come back to that story. And so I finished A Fragile Freedom. And that really was the much of the archival work that set me on the path of chasing Ona in many ways, figuring Ona out, where she went, how she lived. And that set me really for the next 7, 8 years of doing the archival work to tell a story, not just about Ona. Ona was an amazing person, so I wanted to tell that story. But what became very clear to me very quickly was that Ona's story was a way to tell a different version of the founding of the nation, and to think about the ways that these colonies, which became states from Virginia to Pennsylvania to throughout New England, how they changed, how they evolved, what they felt about slavery. And that because Ona traveled through all of these places,
Yeah.
it gave me the opportunity to tell a broader story. And so that's how I started on this journey.
So it was a runaway ad. That's amazing. So Ona Judge, she's a teenage girl when she leaves Mount Vernon. Is one of the many slaves of the Washingtons when he comes up to New York, right, in 1789, to be president of the United States. And I forget now, 6 or 7. The Washingtons bring. Well, he came by himself at first, I guess.
At first.
Yeah. Martha Washington didn't want anything to do with New York. Nor did he?
Not really.
Anyway, but he takes 6 or 7 slaves with him
Mhm.
to New York City. And she's one of them. And then the capital gets moved to Philly. And so I guess 1790, she goes to Philly with the Washingtons. And so pick up the story there. She's like body servant of Martha Washington, among other duties, I'm sure.
Yeah, the Washingtons did make the decision to bring enslaved people with them, both to New York and then to Philadelphia. 7 in New York, and then later on 9, up to 9 at different moments in Philadelphia. And the majority of the enslaved who were brought were men. Ona Judge, along with one other woman, were brought. Ona was Martha's sort of chosen enslaved person. I still haven't come up with a kind of proper title for that. Maybe there never will be, but she had since her teenage years been kind of what Mount Vernon calls a body servant, what we're sort of accustomed to calling her. And that meant she was really responsible for the most intimate of duties with Martha. In addition to that, she would accompany Martha everywhere. And I think that's important to note because Ona became a kind of known entity in late 18th century Philadelphia. She was the woman that traveled with Martha everywhere to her gatherings, her social engagements. Ona would travel. And so she finds herself, and I say this in the book, sort of coming into adulthood in a city that had already begun to dismantle slavery.
Yeah.
And so at the time that Ona and her enslaved companions arrive in Philadelphia, they're kind of in the minority. They're very few.
Oh, there's a much bigger free Black population.
Yeah. And we know that the laws had created that. By 1780, they had begun gradual emancipation. So by the time that Ona arrives, unlike New York, where the numbers were not as different in Philadelphia, it was somewhat odd that Washington had brought, and Martha and George had brought enslaved people with them, that they were living there in a community that was known for had the largest in the North, that is, free Black population. And so it was here that Ona sees free Black entrepreneurs in the street. She watched Mother Bethel's being built, one of the most well-known Black churches in Philadelphia, run by Richard Allen, is literally like a stone's throw away.
Right.
She's exposed to perhaps the ideals of the revolution, of this new founding nation, in a way that she would never have encountered in Virginia. And so she lives a very different life in Philadelphia, although taken from her mother, taken from her siblings, with the exception of one sibling who also served the Washingtons in Philadelphia. She would come of age in a city that was becoming, if not almost, free.
Yeah, and she spends now, 6 years in Philadelphia with the Washingtons. Then isn't there that crazy law where they can only stay 6 months at a time or something? Explain that if you would. He has to send them back.
Yeah, this is one of those moments where, as a historian, when you're in the archives and you're reading letters and where you think almost everything, but you realize you don't. And
No,
I knew, you realize you never do. Well, you think you have a handle on it, right?
Yeah.
That's a better way to phrase a handle on it. And I knew about the law in Pennsylvania, the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780. It basically said that if you were someone who was an enslaver, who held enslaved people, you could come to the state of Pennsylvania, but you could not stay for more than 6 months with enslaved people. And if you did, those people had the right to sue for their liberty, their freedom. And Washington knew about this law. that was still on the books and still effective. But he believed, as did other folks who were there in a kind of business capacity, he felt that he was exempt from that law because he was there on business. He had to be there for extended, and so it's also a reminder of like
Executive privilege is preference.
exactly. It's a reminder how like people are still trying to figure everything out in the 1790s, right?
There was no tradition yet of executive privilege.
And Washington's like, well, okay, well, it doesn't apply to me,
Yeah.
but it did.
Yeah.
And so there's this moment when the Attorney General pays a visit to the Washington's home. George Washington is off, he's down south on a tour, but he has this conversation with Martha and with Washington's secretary, Tobias Lear. And he says, listen, I'm coming to you because you have enslaved people here and they actually have the right to be set free. Just FYI. And it's at this moment, I remember I'm sitting in the Library of Congress and I'm reading through Washington's letters. And Washington, they write to him in Virginia and they ask him, well, what do we do? This is a situation.
Yeah.
What do we do?
Yeah.
And Washington writes back and he's very clear. He says that I'm paraphrasing, we're going to rotate our enslaved people in and out of Pennsylvania every 6 months. We'll send them back to Mount Vernon, or if necessary, a trip across the river to Trenton to a new state would basically reset the clock. And there's this moment where in his letter, he says, and I wish to do this to deceive them, meaning the enslaved, and the public. And that was one of those moments where I was like, George, really? Really, dude? It was that moment.
Well, I bet you had many of those moments in this book.
Did.
George Washington?
And it's like, okay, really, you had a bazillion servants in the house. There were, the possibilities for labor and for who could serve you in Philadelphia. There were many options, but to do this meant something else. And basically the Washingtons functioned with this kind of circulating their folks in and out, rotating them in and out for 6 years.
Boy, yeah, it's hard to believe they went to all that trouble to keep these people enslaved. I mean, there's no, well, okay, but let's follow Ona's story here because she's finally under, well, you developed this under the influences of this much freer city, community, etc. Plus, she grows up. She escapes. What is it? She's 22. She escapes or so. She escapes, leaves the house in 1796, and goes where? I mean, what? And then, how do you recreate that and judge that, the audacity to attempt what she did?
Yeah, I think, Ona was, one thing I should say is that Ona's born, we're not quite certain, 70, 73 or 74. We don't have a
Okay. Her age isn't certain. Yeah. Okay.
So we know it's just from other corroborating documents. It's 1773, 74. So she would have been 22, 23 at this moment. And one thing that's, I think, important to point out is that Ona was strategic about her decision to leave the Washingtons. And I think that's when we're talking about the enslaved and making the decision that is the most risky, dangerous, terrifying decision to make, that sometimes we think it's a reaction as opposed to a response.
Yeah.
And for Ona, maybe it was a little bit of both. She learned that she was going to be given away as a wedding gift.
Oh, that's right. To a nephew or something.
Martha Washington's granddaughter.
That's right.
Eliza Custis Law, who had just been married, recently married. Ona knew her. Ona didn't like her. And she made that clear later on. We have her testimony that says it.
Yeah.
That she had a kind of volcanic temper, and she knew that her life, she would be going back to Virginia. and that her life would be very, very different, that she would no longer be in Philadelphia, where she had been for 6 years. And so it's at this moment when she realizes that her faithful enslavement, right, her service,
Yeah.
was, replaceable.
Mhm.
That's the moment that she decides to leave. And we do have, one thing to remember is that we don't have a written document from Ona. So I was when we're talking about the craft of history and storytelling.
Yeah, there's
Much
no autobiography to draw on.
No, there's no
They're
pamphlet,
interviews.
there's no
They're
letter.
interviews with her,
We
right?
have interviews. Thank
Yeah.
God. There were a couple of interviews she did towards the end, or gave towards the end of her life.
Right.
And they're remarkably useful. They allowed me to corroborate a lot of the facts that I thought were right, but allowed me to kind of corroborate, make certain a timeline even of when she would leave the home, what worked with the placement of the advertisement,
Yeah.
and then a set of letters that would go back and forth afterwards. She tells us in an interview that she had packed her things,
Yeah.
that she had them sent to some friends. She called them the colored people,
Yeah.
friendly colored people, and that she left the Washingtons on May 21st, 1796. She doesn't give us a date. That was a date that I was able to
Mhm.
figure out. And it was that group of freed Black men and women who were very engaged in an underground, before there was a kind of underground railroad, air quotes, around it, that were very involved in helping enslaved people escape.
Mhm.
And she never names them, but
Mm.
we do know that some of the more well-known people, like Richard Allen, spent time in the Washington's house. He was a chimney sweep. He was very involved in the underground, and so she eventually finds herself at the port, at the dock in Philadelphia, on a ship bound for Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And when I figured out where she went and what ship and all of that, I kept asking myself, okay, why Portsmouth? Like, what is it about Portsmouth? Why there? Why not Boston? Why
Yeah.
not, and to me, I'm not quite certain I ever really answered that question for myself, with the exception of that is where her free friends, associates, felt as though she would have the biggest opportunity to remain undetected. And so she ends up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. She's 23.
Not unlike Douglas
Not
going
unlike
to
Douglas.
Bedford because he was advised to go there.
Exactly. You take advice. These are people who would have perhaps paid her passage.
Yeah.
And you arrive in New Hampshire, there are going to be people there who have been alerted that you're coming,
Yeah.
and who are going to help you. And of course, she's very, very careful not to name. And this is the tradition
Yeah.
of any folks who were fugitives, who would run from slavery. And so she finds herself as a young woman. She escapes in May, and by August of that summer,
Yeah.
George and Martha knew exactly where she was.
Right. And now comes the pursuit. Right? I think that's in the title.
Yeah, the
Uh,
pursuit, yes.
Remarkable quest by both George and Martha to get her back. Well, first of all, for those who haven't read the book, I want you to reconstruct that. But also, why were the Washington? How do you come away judging why the Washingtons were so determined to capture this one female slave?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, because at this moment there are over 300 enslaved people living at Mount Vernon. And so the question is,
And he's got, he's a busy man. He's president of the United States, and he's got things to do.
he's busy.
I know. I mean, but the focus on this to try to get her back, and George Washington is working through a senator up there in what's his name, Langdon,
Langdon.
up in New Hampshire to help find her, right?
Well, yes, he's using a senator, he's using the secretary of the treasurer, the treasury, he's definitely a customs officer. He is
Yeah.
using the privilege of the office
Yeah.
to find his runaway. And I think one thing I didn't mention in the beginning is that technically Ona was the property of Martha Washington. She was what was called a dower slave, right? And so
Right.
while the ownership sat with Martha Washington and her estate from her first husband, right? George Washington, as her husband, was in charge of the entire estate. So therefore, any enslaved person that ran away who was a dower slave, he was responsible to the Custis estate for the cost of said runaway, right? And we all know, at least many of us know, that George Washington was often cash strapped, right? So thinking about having to replace an enslaved person was not at the top of his list. But that's not, I don't believe, his primary reason, or Martha's primary reason. There are multiple reasons. And George Washington and the customs collector in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, as well as the Secretary of the Treasury, there are a number of letters that go back and forth. Thank God that George Washington.
Yeah, those must have been a gold mine for you.
Well, you read those and you're like, okay, here it is. Because of course, Ona was doing what she needed to do, which was remain anonymous and not, and could not read or write, to leave behind letters. So we have George writing letters and giving a description of Ona. We don't have any images of Ona, but we have descriptions of her, and explaining what he thought was her reason for running off. He never for one moment thought that it was something that she engineered herself.
No, you can't give up. They can never give up this idea of the loyalty of their slaves.
Right. She had to have been enticed. Seduced was the word that he
By
used.
a Frenchman, right?
By a Frenchman. By the French.
Well, yeah, George had been hating the French ever since the 7 Years' War.
So he blamed the Frenchman. And there was never the acceptance that it could be Ona simply wanting to live a life as a free person, for her responding to this idea that she is going to be given away. These are, but so I think that in terms of George and Martha Washington's desire to reclaim her, there are a couple things at play. One of this is about embarrassment, right? This was a moment where George Washington was, he had already decided he was stepping down, that he would not run again for office. So, he wouldn't go for a third term. He was thinking about wrapping it up, right? This would be his last year in Philadelphia. And
wasn't he kind of always desperate to go back to the private life of the planter? And all that?
He was in many ways, I think, I'll call him a reluctant president, but more so, I think he was someone who served his nation, and he understood this as being a part of that service. It wasn't something that he wanted. He loved Mount Vernon. He loved his farms.
Yeah.
Wanted to be on his horses and going from farm to farm. That was the life. He'd been away for so many years during the Revolution. He wanted to be a citizen, but that was not in the cards for him. And so at this moment, as he's getting ready to return, he is also very thoughtful about his image, about his legacy. And
he knows he's George Washington, huh?
he knows he is going to that in the history books he would be remembered a certain way, and in a lot of ways Ona could disrupt that. He was angry, and he wrote this, that she had been treated, quote, more like a child. So the kind of one of the family.
It's amazing that, and they're not alone. There are plenty of other slaveholders through these decades where we see the same thing happen. They can't believe that loyalty was broken.
Exactly.
What they believed was loyalty was somehow broken. There's something psychological there that is almost hard to fathom, but there it is.
And I think the other issue was that for Martha, this upended her plans, that she had decided to give her very best slave to her granddaughter, who was about, who was getting married or just been married. And so there
are lines of status at stake here and all that stuff. Yeah. Well, so Ona gets up to Portsmouth, ocean port town, of course, but gets to know local free black family, right? Oh, not far out of town. I want you to talk about a particular scene, and this gets us into your writing style, which I find remarkable. And so have your readers, to say the least. It's a scene where the Washingtons send their nephew, I think, isn't it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Burnell Bassett, all the way up to New Hampshire, and they know where Ona is. This senator has helped out to locate her and all of that. And the nephew arrives, is this 1798 or 99? I forget, somewhere in there. And the nephew shows up, and you recreate that scene for about 4 or 5 pages, at least, where the nephew goes and knocks on the door. Now, I don't know how much evidence you have of this, but you create a riveting scene. I mean, that's a page turner. What's going to happen? He comes to the door, you have him knocking on the door, and he tries to persuade Ona, Judge, to just come back. He thinks she'll just agree. And she has a 1-year-old child. She has her little daughter. And Ona says, no. How do you recreate that scene and tell us what happens?
Yeah, it's one of the few moments where I could use some of Ona's words from her interviews, as well as the letters, the testimony that went back and forth between Washington, his nephew, and others who had heard the story that Ona had told over the years later on. One of the things that Washington was very clear about was that he didn't want there to be a big fuss. He didn't want and he writes this, he doesn't want his nephew to inflame or irritate the people of Portsmouth. And that
Don't make a scene. He doesn't want a scene.
Right, no scene, and to bring her back for as easily, as undercover, and as cheap, and he writes that, as possible, for as little expense.
But he sent a ship up there to get her.
Well, he sent Burwell. He didn't send an entire ship. He sent Burwell up and paid all of his expenses on a ship. And there'd been all this correspondence back and forth between Senator Langdon, where Burwell Bassett stayed.
Mm-hmm.
And he does try to reason with her. And actually, it's the customs officer, Thomas Whipple, who says, if you offer her freedom at the end of your life, she'll come back. And so there's this really interesting letter that goes back and forth.
That's right. You get that out of a letter.
Right. It's from a letter that the customs collector says, look, if you say you're going to set her free eventually, she'll come back, no problem. And Washington's like, okay, wait a minute, freeze. Like, I am not negotiating with a slave. She's my property and she's going to come back, right? It's that moment where he gets his response, unlike some of his other correspondence with the customs officer, he's like, oh, basically, hell no, is basically, no, get her on the boat. And he tells his nephew to go up, to be as careful, discreet, and to convince Ona to come back.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's actually following his uncle's uncle by marriage, his request. So he does go to the cabin to where she's staying. At this point, Ona's been married.
Yeah.
She has a 1-year-old, as you said. The stakes
and she marries a sailor, right? Who's off to sea.
She marries a free black man named Jack Staines, who was a sailor, and at that time and like many black men, were at sea when this all happened. So she was alone, but the stakes were higher. This was not just about Ona anymore. This was about Ona and her child, because under the law, this child was the property of Martha Washington and her estate as well. Okay. So this is, this moment where I also allow myself, with Never Caught, I allowed myself to kind of write the way that is most comfortable for me,
Yeah.
to use the sources that I have. I'm always very careful if there's something that I don't have written documentation. Um, I'll use words that suggest as much. So
Yeah,
perhaps,
you do use a lot of likely, could have, must have, and I understand that. I've done this myself. So
yeah, yeah,
uh,
it's
you're
the
recreating a scene that happened without every detail.
right, and it is the I remember once I was trying to explain this to some graduate students, and they were asking, well, how do you write something where you don't have a
Yeah.
document in front of you? And I said, okay, how many of you have dogs? And most of the class raised their hands. I said, all right, you're not at home with the dog every day, but when the mailman comes, the dog's going to go bananas, right? The dog's going to bark. You're not there to hear the dog barking.
But whether you see it or not,
Whether
it
you
happened.
see it or not, it's happening. And in many ways, did I have a document that said that Ona's child was clinging to her skirt? No. But I had a 1-year-old at one point, and I know what they did when they're teetering and just learning to walk, and they're probably holding on to your skirt. And Ona does tell us what she did say to him when he
And
came.
you also instinctively knew that Ona would have grabbed that child in the presence of this nephew.
Who wouldn't? Like,
Yeah,
once again,
because he's a slave catcher, right?
he's
At
a
that point,
slave
he's basically
catcher.
a slave catcher.
She's alone. That's her baby.
Yeah.
You are not going to not pull your child, and you don't have to be a mother to know that. You just know it. That, once again, do I have the document that says that? No. But do I feel comfortable speculating that it did happen? Yeah, I do. And so that's the way I kind of explain. They're never huge leaps in terms of the kind of what I call informed speculation, right? They're moments that are natural, authentic. And I use the language because as a historian, I feel responsible for making it clear that this is from documented evidence, but I
Right.
also know that in terms of the Black experience,
Yeah.
that much of that doesn't exist. So it doesn't mean we discount it. It means we figure out a way to bring it into the narrative.
And there's that rich and wonderful and risky gray area that after you've worked on a subject, lived with a subject, a character in this case, so long, you begin to trust a certain instinct, don't you? Your own instinct, that you can speculate on this a little bit because this is somehow in the character of I know I've done a little of this. It's risky, but sometimes because you know the person well enough. Well, tell how that scene finally ends, because the what's his name?
Burwell Bassett, yeah.
Bassett goes away angry as hell, and then comes back and told somebody, maybe the customs guy, this time I'm going to take her by force.
Yeah.
And he goes back and Ona's gone.
Yep. She's not crazy. She knew.
She knew this Black family, in some town, I don't know, 8 or 10 miles away, and she fled to them, and Bassett didn't know where to go. So he got back on the ship and went back to Virginia.
Yep. I mean, it's really, it's
Amazing.
also, it's so powerful because here's this woman who is a fugitive. Who
Yeah.
is literally slamming the door in the face of the president's nephew and basically saying, hell no, I'm not going.
Yeah.
Basically, you will have to come get me.
Yeah.
And understands the community around her,
Right.
understands the sensibilities of the community, and also knows, and she says that she hired a boy with a wagon, and then he took her away to Greenland, which was a couple of miles,
Oh, that
which
never
was
happened.
a free Black, and spent basically she went there to hide while her
Right.
husband was at sea. But it was also this moment where she knows Portsmouth's too hot. Like they know where she is. She's not going to be able to stay there.
Right. All the way up in New Hampshire. I mean, again, this is the 1790s. I mean, this transportation is not, well, it's maritime primarily in this story, but the pursuit here by the Washingtons. Now, on that for a moment, how did you come away, I don't want to just say feeling about, but understanding George and Martha Washington? I mean, you know, there is all of this, you know, symbol. I mean, and you came of age in Philadelphia. You're an early American historian. You study the founding era and so on. You know, and yet I found that you write quite sensitively about George Washington, you know, especially at the beginning of the book. This is a man who gave everything in his body and his mind to the war, and, you know, and commanded 100,000 men, 30,000 had died, and on and on and on. And yet, down to this kind of detail, he's not going to let a slave go.
Nope.
How did you come away from that? Just with a deeper sense of contradiction, or what about George Washington?
You know, I mean, I honestly, because I have studied, you know, the founding era, none of it was particularly surprising. I think
Okay.
what I was surprised about, or what I found, was that Martha Washington and George Washington were a great study in contrast, right? Of contrast, that they, with respect to slavery, that it was very clear that George Washington's feelings, his notions about slavery had changed over time. He had evolved. He had spent what was now decades, right, in Philadelphia and throughout much of the North, that he interacted with people like the Marquis de Lafayette, who was, you know, constantly saying, what's up with this slavery, George? Come on. You know, that he was exposed to many things, so that by the time he died, he would mandate in his will that upon the death of Martha, his enslaved people were to be set free.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think it's really powerful. People typically say that was powerful because he's really probably one of the first, he was definitely, of course, the first president, but one of the sort of most powerful people at that moment who had been Southern slaveholders to do such a thing. And I agree.
That. You narrate his death in 99 and what he's doing with his will at that point.
And you know, it's this moment where I'm careful as a historian to try, in much the same way that I tried to give the attention and detail and shape of Ona, I was trying to do it with George and Martha as well.
Yeah.
And I couldn't help but think, though, what a move by George, right? To make this decision at the end of his life to do what he did. But what could have happened if he had done it while he was alive? Like, how could that have changed things if he had the courage to do what he did in death while he was alive, right? While he was living. And we also know that Martha has no interest in setting anybody free. And
that made me wonder, did you at any moment think, is he just trying to find Ona to honor his wife? I mean, because his wife wanted her so badly?
Oh, most certainly.
I don't know.
I honestly believe that the pursuit was driven by Martha.
Okay.
And part of the reason is because Ona wasn't the first person who ran away from Mount Vernon or the Washingtons, right? And they had put ads in newspapers before, but never had they gone to this kind of prolonged, this goes over years, right? Where they're still, he's doing it as president, he's doing it as private citizen. There's something else here, right? And of course,
and it is a marriage after all, where they had been apart for years at a time.
For years,
right? And that he would want to somehow do this for her, I don't.
Well, they were genuine partners. I do believe there was. We don't have much of Martha Washington burnt most of the correspondence between her and George Washington. There are a few documents that remain. She literally just threw them in the fire after he died. And because she knew there'd be nosy people like me going through her stuff and, seeing what she thought. And so she burned it. And so we don't.
How did God ever let that happen? All these letters over the years.
Well,
Just
we
kidding.
know that happens. And that's why as
Yeah.
historians, we are just invigorated when we do find that little piece of evidence, that one little interview, that confirms an entire story that before Never Caught was written, very few people knew who Ona Judge was. And for me, it gave the opportunity to, as I said, tell this amazing story about this bold woman who outlived everybody. She outlived the Washingtons.
Oh,
She
yeah.
outlived most of her family. But to be
She
able,
outlives her daughters too.
she
Right?
outlives all of her children, her husband, everyone. And she dies in 1848, and she leaves behind these interviews
Yeah.
in the Liberator, the most, as that's it's the hotbed of abolition at this moment. And while she may not have called herself an abolitionist, she was definitely telling her story, which became a part of this abolitionist rhetoric. So she's moved from the era of the revolution up through abolition, and she's telling her story, and to be able to write it and to try to do it in a way that, and I David, I know we're going to talk about writing, but I wanted to write this book. I wanted to write something that my peers would respect, but that my aunts would read.
I understand. Believe me, I understand. Well, but before we leave Ona Judge, I mean, amazing life, if you think about it, in its quietude. I mean, she kept quiet all those decades, frankly, 4.5 decades. She lives up there in New Hampshire, makes no show of herself at all, if possible, and then does these interviews in 45 and 47. Which, and you said she didn't maybe consider herself an abolitionist. Well, she doesn't have to. She lived it. I mean, but just wanted the dignity of running her own household and her own life, which is what freedom meant to her, right? Freedom. And the husband, by the way, Staines. Staines. Yeah, I mean, she marries this guy as soon as she meets him. He's a sailor. She needed protection, of course. And she even goes by his name, right, after a long while. But just a life of anonymity, except for those 2 interviews. And then you find her and you recreate her. And you recreate her life. It's truly remarkable, the connection of an otherwise unknown, largely unnamed slave woman and the founder of the country, President of the United States, and his wife, and the way the 2 connect. But what connects here is the story of slavery itself, and the story of fugitive slaves, runaways, escapes. I mean, the bravery of that young woman to do what she did is just stunning. Because, well, all right, let's talk about writing. This is a book you wrote for, you may have had one eye on your colleagues, but you wrote that for a general audience. And now you're writing everything from children's literature to, I guess, screenplays, to books for a very broad audience. Why this turn? Why are you trying to write for a much broader public when in the academy, we both go to history department meetings where we are constantly discussing whether to hire this person or that person because they've made that breakthrough and that breakthrough and this breakthrough. Maybe they haven't made that breakthrough, and so on and so forth. Why this turn in your own approach to writing?
You know, I wrestled with how I was going to write this book, and I'm trained to write a certain way. I'm trained to write the way I wrote A Fragile Freedom, my first book, right?
Sure.
And
And we always do that with graduate students because we don't want to, you know, sell them down the river of narrative history before their time.
not yet. Write your first book, then do it.
Right.
But for me, it was also, well, there were a couple things at play. One, I said, Erica, you're writing a book that doesn't paint the best picture of, or what would Doug Bradburn say? He said, not the most promising moment for the Washingtons is,
No, not at all.
this book. But I appreciate your comments that I wrote with sensitivity and sensibility about Washington, because I tried very hard to. I wasn't looking for acceptance from people who do founding history. There's a cohort of folks who, they committed their lives to that. I was very clear that I was writing African American women's history,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
And there's a different kind of canonical process and inventive language writing that we do. And so once I kind of allowed I had always felt very stifled writing in ways that we're supposed to write as academics. And then I finally just said, Erica, okay, if Ona ran away from George Washington, how are you going to be scared to write the way you write? Right? Honestly, Erica, get a grip and just go write the way you write, and write for the audience that means something to you. And I care deeply about the profession. I train graduate students. This is important, but I also want to
like footnotes.
And I had the footnote fight with my editor. I was like, you gotta have footnotes. She was like, Erica, we're not doing footnotes. You can do blind notes in the back of the book, but you're not gonna do it's distracting to the eye for the general reader. And I was like, what? What do you mean distracted? Like, that's how I read, but that's not how most people read, right? And so once I said, okay, well, as long as the notes are there so that my colleagues can go fact check and do what they need to do, then I'm fine with it. But I really, I gave myself the space and the approval to write in a voice that felt more natural just to me as a writer, and also wanted to make the statement that you can do that and still be considered a decent historian.
Yeah. Well, I agree with that. And I'm all for narrative history now. I think narrative history can still be deeply scholarly. The two can be combined. And the worst thing we can do is to write in theoretical jargon that nobody can read. I mean, anyway, but why the turn to children's literature? What motivates that? What are you trying to do with that? I mean, I respect it enormously. I don't think I can do it though.
Oh, it's hard. It's really hard.
Well, there are these children's book authors who know what they're doing.
Well,
and
I knew that. When I finished writing Never Caught, I didn't feel like I was done. And I felt like it's one thing to write for an audience where maybe you're going to read it in college, maybe you'll read it as an adult on your own. But if we truly want to change or influence the way that history is taught, I have to write something that's going to allow teachers to help students see a different narrative about the founding of the nation, and that center Black people, Black women in particular. So if I don't do it, who's going to do it? I mean, it was really that simple. And I talked to my agent. I was like, we should do a children's book. And she was like, okay. Now, I wasn't dumb enough to know that, or to think that I can just go write for children. I'd never done that before. And so I teamed up with
Yeah.
a writer. I have a co-writer for that book.
And Simon and Schuster has a good young,
They do.
whatever they call it, young readers
Young readers.
division.
Yep.
I've now connected with or contracted with a children's or a young readers author who's going to do a Douglas that I'm basically kind of consulting on. I'm not writing it.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. They have a whole division doing that.
They do. And I think Aladdin Books is, you know, who I wrote Never Caught for young people. And it immediately, I just felt like in some ways that would be more impactful than than the adult version that I know. And it is like, I get emails and letters from kids. And the first year that the children's version came out, I get photos that teachers would send me of their kids for Halloween dressed as Ona Judge, or they're decorating their desk or their door with Ona Judge.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this is a woman who was forced, as you say, to live in anonymity for almost half a century. And now little children are dressing up like her. They are, they know her name, they know her story. And
don't you think Harriet Tubman needs a companion in all these children's books?
Yes.
It can't all be about Harriet Tubman, for God's sake. Anyway,
well, yeah, I mean, that's a good point, though. That's a really good point, that it can't just be one narrative. And that part of this deal that I have with Simon and Schuster, it's really a deal to do African American women's history,
right,
from the early period up through the early 20th century, to give teachers and librarians the tools that they need to offer a varied interpretation of our history. And, you know, hopefully it won't get banned in other states.
Well, can we talk about that a bit? Have you had any kind of pushback about either the main book, Never Caught, or the children's version? I don't know. I mean, I can't imagine what would be so terrible to that right-wing book police out there. But has there been any, because you're dealing with George Washington here,
Yeah.
has there been much pushback on that, or have you managed to sidestep the book banners, I hope?
Well, you know, before I wrote the book, I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times.
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah.
And I didn't title it, they did, but they titled it, it was about Ona Judge, and it was before the book came out, and it was called George Washington Slave Catcher.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's this like,
oh, they always control the titles.
we have nothing to do with that, because that was not the title I chose, right?
No, I'm sure it wasn't. Right.
And so there's this image of a hand with like a shackle around it, and then a little mean George Washington like standing on top. And
GW was shackles.
Yes. It's honestly, I was surprised when they shared it with me the night before it went out, but it went viral. Like that op-ed went viral. It came out on President's Day.
God, I realize that.
It was, yes, it was a thing. And I hadn't really written for that kind of audience before. I was used to relatively polite academic audiences. And it was really that op-ed where I got some of the worst, just terrible, hostile, not just like comments. You don't read the comments because they're always horrible. I actually asked them, I asked the Times if they would disable the comment section, and they agreed. Because I didn't feel like I needed to see that. But they knew where I was a professor, so they found my email, and then my inbox, from everything from, you know, every bad word in the book, to people saying they were going to lynch me. And that's not something you typically think you're going to encounter as a historian, that you are going to, your life is going to be threatened by people who are enraged with
Yeah.
your craft. And, I had to figure out a way how to protect myself, like reading that can be really emotionally, just
Mhm.
psychologically very difficult. And so for a while, I actually, I decided I wasn't going to read my emails. I had someone who, you don't trust everybody with your emails, but I knew that I could trust one person at that time who had the time to read through my emails and had the nice folder and the mean folder, and that was my mom. And
Oh my
so my
God,
mom,
really?
I gave her my password. And
Woo!
my husband's really busy. He couldn't sit there and plus he was enraged and gonna drive his car through,
Yeah,
somebody's house.
he was gonna go break their knees,
Yeah,
probably.
he didn't need to read those. But my
God,
mom actually said to me, Erica, let me read your emails. Let
wow,
me hold that. And
wow.
I know the right people. I know what's a good, what's a bad. I'll create 2 folders for you. You don't have to read the negative emails. But I kept those negative emails, David, and I keep them as a reminder, right? That what we do, it means something,
Yeah,
different things to people, but it's also the reminder that the work that I do is in many ways race work. It is considered, I am advancing the field of African American, of women's history,
right.
and that there are always going to be folks, at least probably during my lifetime, that contest it. And I need to be reminded. It's great to see a New York Times and this award and that award, but I also have to keep myself grounded and remember where I come from, and remember what some people, not a lot, but
Yeah.
some people, what they think about it.
Wow. Thank you for telling that story. I had never realized that part of what happened. Wow.
But
Uh,
the good part about it is that those crazy people who write those kinds of emails, they
yeah.
don't read books.
No, no,
They
no.
just read op-eds because it's a
Right.
thousand words.
Yeah, they'll read a viral Times op-ed because it got sent to them by some other source.
Right. But not a book.
They'll
And
go after you because you're part of the whatever, choose your label, black, women, liberal, academic, whatever they think we are, ruining American history.
right.
You know, what we're really doing is making it richer. Uh, oh my God. Well, I just have one more quick thing to get you to talk about, and I want to go to these questions we're getting.
Sure.
Storytelling.
Mm.
You know, it's not always easy in the academy, let's say, and I have enormous respect for what we do in our craft with scholarship. I'm all for every breakthrough we can find, but we do have historians around, don't we? Because they tell stories, and human beings are probably hardwired for stories. What's the first thing you do with a child? So talk about that just a moment, if you would. I mean, I think some historians are much more conscious of storytelling than others. At the end of the day, I think we all do it in some way or another. But I think there's a number of us now who are very conscious of it because we know there's an audience.
Yeah, I, I honestly didn't think of myself as a quote storyteller
Yeah.
until I wrote Never Caught. And if you asked me who I was, like, what do you do, Erica, before Never Caught? I'm a historian. I'm a professor. That
Yeah,
was
I'm
my,
a scholar of this and of that. Yeah,
yep.
right. Yeah, yeah,
And then there was something interesting that happened when I allowed myself to be me, to write the way that I write.
yeah.
There was something freeing about writing this book that was my declaration of just who I am as a writer,
Yeah.
who I will always be. And, you know, on the little, I think it really became apparent to me when people started saying, well, what do you do? And after I wrote Never Caught, my answer would typically be, I'm a writer,
Yeah.
I'm a historian, you know.
There was a time when historians had to make their case for being writers. Of course they're writers. I mean,
they did, but I would never.
who would have ever told Ed Morgan he's not a writer?
We didn't categorize ourselves like that.
Yeah.
And so I think that now if you go and you look at my Twitter handle or you look at my IG handle, like I say, when I describe in my bio who I am, I just say storyteller, period.
I noticed that.
And it's in part because we're all storytellers, whether we want historians, whether we describe or categorize ourselves as that. And I'm actually very invested in this notion of writing in a way that allows me to teach without it being painful, right? It's like when your mother would put sugar on top of the medicine you had to take to make it go down a little easier. Like if I teach somebody something, if I recreate the way we think, even the popular imagination about something, because it's delivered in a way that feels smooth or feels is engaging, then I feel like I've done something.
Yeah, and there's no greater feeling than hearing from a reader you know is not an academic, but reads a lot, you can tell. And they somehow comment on how, I don't know, you captured them, they stayed with the story, etc., and they learned something from that. There's nothing better than that. I'm going to go to some questions here. We've got a wonderful question about Mount Vernon and that population of slaves that the Washingtons owned, descendants, and has Ona Judge played in it all now since your book in the development of any kind of descendant history with Mount Vernon?
That's a great question, especially given the most recent piece that appeared about George Washington and West Ford, that the possible son of George Washington. And I referenced that in Never Caught in a Footnote, a blind note. But, one of the things that's really, I think, important about a place like Mount Vernon is that there is this, over the past, I'd say maybe 8-9 years, there's much more, there's a more of a willingness engage with the stories of the enslaved who lived there. And prior to 10 years ago, that wasn't really the case, right? And it's still kind of touchy and difficult, because we also have to remember, like, who runs Mount Vernon. It's the Ladies Association of Mount Vernon that runs it, and they are dependent also on the million visitors that they have every year. That's $24 million just from the people who walk through the doors, the bus trips with the kids who, want to
part of the Washington D.C. historical nexus.
That's what you do. That's where you go. And so, I was very, Ona's situation in terms of her lineage, I did go back and I tracked and traced where her, as far as I could, where her siblings, where they went. The trail runs a little cold around the Civil War, but I did track them to what would become where Arlington National Cemetery was, because that's where George Washington's adopted grandson would live, and would eventually take a third of Martha Washington's enslaved people.
And Robert E. Lee married into that family.
Exactly. So there we have the Revolutionary War and the Civil War coming together. So, but the trail sort of runs cold there, and because Ona's children, we know she has 3. There are 2 daughters and a son. The son goes off like his father, becomes a sailor, he disappears. We lose track of him.
That's what happened to too many sailors.
That we know, right? And by the 1830s, we don't know where William, we don't know where he is. Yeah. The 2 daughters, they die young and they don't have children. So Ona doesn't have kind of direct descendants from her children. And so, but there was definitely, and more work to be done. although I'm not doing it, I'm tired, in terms of tracking their family, but I did track them, and eventually the story had to stop somewhere. So I tracked them through the 1850s, and I do that with the last chapter of the book,
Mhm.
where I talk about her sister, whose name was Philadelphia, who was actually forced to live and do the work that Ona was supposed to do with the granddaughter. So when she runs away, Martha Washington sends Philadelphia, Ona's sister, to go serve her granddaughter. And through a bunch of kind of twists and turns, she eventually finds her freedom. She marries a man named William Costin. They have a family, they're traceable. So
The sisters reunite? Does Ona ever reunite with us? No.
never, never. But what I wanted to do was to show how Philadelphia
Yeah.
and her family were wrestling to find freedom at the same time that Ona was, just in a different way. And so we know that those relatives exist, but I've only tracked them up through the Civil War.
Wow. There's another question. It's very related. It's kind of public history question about Mount Vernon. So since your book, this person says she visited Mount Vernon and Ona has become part of the tour there, or at least there's more than a mention, apparently. So Ona Judge is now part of the tour at Mount Vernon, like the Hemmingses are part of the tour at Monticello.
They did, they had an exhibit, Lives Bound Together, where that I'm not certain if it's still running since the pandemic, but there were 6 or 7 enslaved people that were kind of focused on, and
Yeah.
were represented by kind of silhouettes, and Ona's one of them, right? So she is kind of, she's a part of that story. But I'd say more importantly, this is one of the kind of most important moments of my life, not just as a scholar, writer, whatever, but
Yeah.
I got a call, this was this past summer, from a teacher in Virginia. And there had been a Black History contest
Mhm.
that the governor of Virginia had issued. And it was actually a contest about state historical markers.
Uh-huh.
And these kids had to make the case for why a historical marker should exist. And this was done during Black History Month. Well, I think it was a 4th grade class in Virginia, in
Mhm.
Fairfax County. They wrote a long, compelling argument, and the teacher's calling me to tell me that Ona got a historical marker. And could I
Whoa.
come to the ceremony? And I was like, oh,
Whoa.
of course I'll come. But the best part is that the marker is right across the street from Mount Vernon. So, and I don't think Mount Vernon was too happy about that, but because there are no other historical markers, or maybe one other that have anything, that don't have something specifically to do with George or Martha Washington. But
Yeah.
every time you go on a bus trip, every time you drive down near the post office at Mount Vernon, you will see a sign, a historical marker with Ona Judge's name on it and a description of who she is, who she was, and that will always be there.
Well, hey, that's fantastic. I can share with you that I did this book called The Slave No More, about 2 slave narratives written after the war, one of them by Wallace Turnage, who escaped in Mobile, Alabama. Well, one thing led to another. It took about 10 years, and there's now a Wallace Turnage marker in downtown Mobile, Alabama. Things happen. You never know from this kind of obscure research we do. There's one other question here that wonders, and I know you just said you're done with Ona Judge, but did you ever consider writing fiction about this, a fictionalized version of this, or do you feel like, well, that becomes my question then. Do you feel like writing this for young readers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is a historian's equivalent of that?
Yeah, I think writing fiction is, I'm not certain that's my wheelhouse. I'll never say never, right? What I'll say is
Yeah.
that
It's a different art.
it's a different art, and I don't pretend to know it, right? I feel more comfortable writing narrative nonfiction, and also feeling as though the work can be impactful in a way that changes social studies curriculums, that can change, in ways that fiction can't do. We can, of course, change a curriculum or change a canon, but it doesn't necessarily change what the National Association of Social Studies thinks should be on a test or what have you.
Right.
And so I'm kind of deeply committed to historical authenticity and what I'm doing. But I'll never say never.
Good for you. I mean, have you now, I mean, all the talks you've given on this book or everything related to it, have you been invited by the ladies of Mount Vernon to do the Ona Judge story, or is that, have they got on board or not?
I will say this: when the book first came out, Doug Bradburn, who was then the head of the library, but now is CEO of Mount Vernon, he invited me.
Yeah.
Invited me to come and give a talk.
Yeah, good. Good.
There were so many people. It was an overflow room. It was C-SPAN. It was a thing.
Yeah.
But that wasn't an invitation necessarily from the ladies.
Yeah. Well,
I think
Mount trying to be in the 21st century.
it might take a little longer.
Yeah.
For that invitation to come, but that's okay.
Well, everything that's happened up at Monticello may help here. I mean, they've been on this now for quite some time, and they've done it well.
Yep.
But it's not that long ago when you could talk about these things at the homes of the founders, and it turns out, it just sort of enriches their history. It doesn't ruin anything.
No.
Anyway, gosh, I mean, we're now an hour and 20 minutes into this. I think I may let you go, but I just want to say thanks. This is fun. We could keep talking all evening, I think, about the craft of storytelling and your works and your book. What we didn't talk about, you might go out with this, is you're now working with film, and particularly with the HBO series on the Gilded Age. You want to talk about that a bit? Yeah, you're not only a historical consultant, a role I've had too, but you're even a producer.
I am. Yeah, it's.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Exactly.
What does that mean?
I know it really. I'm fortunate once again. It's the opportunity to work to do storytelling, right?
Yeah.
The largest of audiences, and I'm a co-executive producer on the Gilded Age, which in part I was asked to come on as a consultant because of my experience with African American women's history in the 19th century. And
there's a key character in Gilded Age.
And the key character, one of the key characters, right? And so I came on as a historian, as a consultant, and then just began to work more with Julian Fellows, the creator and writer of the show, and really kind of helped with story and authenticity. And once again, this just goes back to storytelling. So I do everything from read scripts and give notes to be on set while we're shooting, to talking with the actors, with the talent, helping them understand the place and the time in which their character exists. And it's once again, it's just it's an extension, although this is like, it's rooted in the time period, but this is fiction, right? Although we brought in a couple of characters who are real, who lived during that time, but it's just an extension of what I do. And
well, it's good news that they're bringing in real historians, at the actual point of production. Usually we're just, you go to a meeting or two and you consult, and then you get out of the way.
Yeah, no, this was from kind of beginning to end, and
that's great.
We were renewed for season 2, so I'm working on that now.
Oh, cool. Well, I got a lot of it yet to watch. I've only watched the first 3 episodes, so
keep watching.
I will, especially after this. Well, Erica, thank you so much for doing this. This has been great fun, and I know our audience loved it, and they're still with us.
Oh,
and,
great.
God, there's even more questions coming in. Well, it's just saying terrific, and thank you for doing it. Okay, these are just accolades now. Well, anyway, thanks. Carry on. Keep
Thank you.
telling stories, my friend.
I will. You do the same.
All right, be well. Thanks very much. And thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thanks, everyone.